Hi, my name's Derek Sanford. I'm Director of Security Engineering at Avalara. I'm here to talk to you today about designing for security, and in particular, protecting your data while in transit. All right, so what are we going to be talking about? First of all, we'll talk about what Transport Layer Security 1.2 is and why it matters to you. We'll move on to talk about legacy protocol deprecation and our timelines around that. And then we'll talk about how that impacts your integration specifically and what you can do, whether you're connecting with Avalara with your SDK, without your SDK, or whether you're developing another app that you want to make sure remains secure while communicating on the internet. We're going to talk about what you can do to make sure of that. All right, so let's jump in. What is TLS version 1.2 and why does it matter? You've heard me say that before. So first of all, it's transport layer security, and it is the hardened standard for secure network communications. This is what all secure enterprises and government organizations uses to ensure that their data remains secure and encrypted while traversing the internet. So the 1.2 matters because it resolves known vulnerabilities in previous transport protocols, whether it's SSL v2 or v3, whether it's TLS 1.0 and 1.1. There's a number of vulnerabilities over the years. So you've got Heartbleed and Poodle and Beast. These are all things that have made the headlines. They've enabled things like retrieving server memory over the network unauthenticated, or decrypting network and traffic, or potentially performing a man-in-the-middle attack. Also, TLS 1.2 uses stronger default encryption ciphers. And these overall are considered by the industry to be more secure standards. So many of these were computationally weak against modern computing, or have some known technical flaw that prevents them from being used by secure operations worried about the integrity of their encryption. This is all in service to ensure that your data is protected. This is using modern standards that have been beaten up against by attackers and defenders across the world, is the way that you make sure that your data remains secure. This also serves to help deal with business requirements. If you're in the finance, payments industry, you're familiar with PCI DSS compliance, and it impacts your application. If you're at all dealing with government industries or federal organizations, NIST 852 mandates TLS 1.2. So it's about good security practices, but it's also about business forces pressuring organizations to move towards TLS 1.2. All right. So legacy protocol deprecation. In order to use a secure protocol, you must stop using insecure ones. All right. So in service of that, beginning January 1st, 2022, Avalara will only support TLS 1.2. This is in order to protect our customers and their data. So let's talk a little bit about how this will impact your integration and what it means to you. All right. So first of all, what does it take to support TLS 1.2 for you and your integration, your applications? So the first thing to note is that we will be releasing SDKs that ensure that this connection is mandated. And for those of you already targeting modern frameworks, the effort around this will be minimal and relatively easy. Most of them already support this, and there will be no interruption to operations. There'll be no problems for you. If you're targeting a legacy framework, you may need to update in order just to support the modern secure internet standards of the world. But they may contain unresolved security flaws that are no longer supported by the vendors. .NET framework, Microsoft only supports more modern versions, and many of the older versions have unresolved security issues. That's just one example. For those of you not using our SDK, it is recommended that you make sure that you set TLS as a mandatory for your connections, and that you use it as a security best practice. This isn't just about Avalara. This is about any application you develop, really. You want to make sure that you don't use protocols that can be broken. It's a best practice for your security. It's the right thing to do to protect your data. The other thing to note here is that operating systems can impact TLS negotiation. So whether you're on modern operating systems, or the frameworks underlying it, like OpenSSL, that are part of the OS, both of those things require a certain level of upkeep to make sure they support these modern standards. The final thing to address here, many of the people on SOAP are going to be targeting minimum frameworks that are older by nature. The SOAP framework is mostly in maintenance at this point. The features are being delivered all to the REST SDK. So it's important to consider when you're going to update your integration whether or not it's the right time to migrate to REST. There'll be a talk from Acumetics at 1 p.m. as part of Avalara Next that you can hear the journey of one person who's migrated from SOAP to REST. Finally, I just want to reiterate connections not utilizing TLS 1.2, whether there are SDK or your own custom integrations with us, will not be supported after January 1st, 2022. So it's important to get on these more secure frameworks and to update your integrations. So how do you get there? So the first thing to note is for REST v2, we'll be delivering an SDK update in Q1 of 2021. This will enforce the secure standards we're talking about, and if you're using our SDK, the connections to us will be secure. The REST endpoint, again, will be specifically, but the same date as everything else. The REST endpoint will be made TLS v1.2 mandatory by January 1st, 2022. On the right here, you can see some examples of the frameworks and how they align. So you can see C# will require .NET 4.0, Java will require Java 8.2.1.3.4. And then I want to note here things around that I mentioned. JavaScript, PHP, Ruby all have an open SSL dependency. So you need to ensure you're on a modern supported version of SSL that'll allow you to connect to TLS 1.2 and preferably doesn't support older, weaker, insecure connections. Moving on to SOAP, we have the same story. Q1 of 2021, we'll release an update to our supported SDK libraries. And the endpoint will be forced to be mandatory TLS 1.2 by January 1st, 2022. So again, on the right, you can see framework of the minimum framework versions we expect to be targeting. And you can see the areas where we know there is a open SSL dependency. JavaScript, PHP, and Ruby are the examples of that. All right, so you know if you're using our SDK, you're good. So what if you're not? Or what if you're wondering how to make this secure elsewhere? So enforcing TLS 1.2 connections. How do you make this mandatory? One thing I want to note here in the beginning is you may want to consider TLS 1.3. So to make sure that you can, as your application is modernized, as we modernize, in a year or two, TLS 1.3 will start to become a standard. So you might not want to. You may want to ensure you enable that support. But in these cases, we've focused on TLS 1.2. All right, so first up, the first example is Java. It's very easy. It's an application, it's a setting you set globally, and it's simply system set property, right? And you set this for all your HTTPS protocols, and you TLS 1.2. And again, I mentioned TLS 1.3 earlier. It's something to consider. All right, so slightly more difficult in complexity. Let's talk about Python. So here, you can see we're importing SSL and URLlib2. And we're setting a context, an SSL context. It's not the SSL protocol TLS 1.2 piece inside the context we're calling that matters. It's actually the options we're setting past that. So you see no SSL v2, no SSL v3, etc. You're opting out of these protocols being options during negotiation. And that is actually what you want. And in this case, this would support TLS 1.3 because we have not explicitly disabled it. And finally, when we go to look at the response with URLlib2, we're utilizing the context with the options we had just previously set. So finally, an example in C#. You can see here we're instantiating a new HTTP client handler, and the important piece, and really the only critical piece for setting SSL in C# is this SSL protocols, right? So you can see here SSL protocols equals SSL protocols.tls 1.2. Or TLS 1.2. This makes this connection mandatory. And this is actually some sample code that was written for us to test this. So you can see the endpoint URL here. If you modify that, you can do a lightweight test, and this connection would fail if the connection wasn't TLS 1.2. That's that. We'll be providing on developer.avalara.com a landing page to help you all navigate the TLS process and the complexities surrounding it. And I will be handing it over to John Velozzi for Designing with Resiliency. Thank you. Have a great day.
Hi, welcome to Avalara's next conference. My name is John Velazzi, and I'm working on the API team at Avalara. Today, I'll be talking about building robust integrations with our APIs. So I want to start with a statement, and that's that building a robust integration is the responsibility of the service and of the client. So today, I'll be talking about what we do at Avalara to hold up our end of that, and what you can do to make sure that integrations are good from your end. So Avalara's service stability starts with how we write our services. And so we use database transactions, queuing, and retries, standard fault-tolerant strategies to write our services. We also use microservices to make sure that the boundaries of services are good and that they're maintainable. And we have multi-availability zone and multi-region deployments in our infrastructure to make sure that our cloud systems are always up. So we also do testing, performance testing and chaos testing. We make sure that the performance of the system is good and that it's efficient. And then we also make sure that introducing instability into the system will be tolerated by the system itself, and also that our DevOps engineers can react to those situations. And our DevOps engineers are monitoring the system 24/7 to make sure that we meet our SLIs and SLOs. We also have automated monitoring and alarms to make sure that we get notified if we go outside of those boundaries. And if you think there's a problem with our system, you can always check on status.avalara.com to see the status of all of our systems. So now I'll talk about error handling, which is the first strategy that you can use to make sure that your integration is robust. So the integration process is cyclical. So first you build your integration by understanding the API and creating your system. But then you need to also monitor your system, the logs, and listen to your users. And that will give you feedback so that you can iterate and improve your system. And so in your logs and from your users, you'll hear about different types of errors, and those are in two main categories: 400s and 500s. The 500 errors are service side errors, and those would be the responsibility of Avalara. And so our monitoring and logging and our support engineers will be watching for that. But if you think that there's something that we may have missed, you can always go to support.avalara.com. But on your end, what you can do to deal with those is make sure that you have retries in your system and make sure that there's a good amount of time in between retries. So the next kind of error is the 400 error. These are errors that are caused by client input. So things like malformed JSON, or the wrong password is submitted, or if there's a required field that's missing. Those are the kinds of things that will give you a 400 error. And with your 400 error, you'll get a JSON response in the HTTP response. And so next I'll go over a couple of those JSON responses and how people have solved those issues. So the first one is the document code conflict error. And this happens when you try to create a transaction with the same code more than once. And in this case, the integrator used the date and the company code, which are not unique. It only allows for one transaction per day. So in this case, the integrator used a GUID instead, and so that allows total uniqueness for each transaction. And that's what we would recommend. GUID's not required. Anything that's sufficiently unique would solve this issue. The next one that I'll talk about is an integrator got an entity not found error. And this was happening because users were typing in the wrong company code. And in order to solve this, this integrator use the list companies API to look up what company codes this user had access to, and then listed them in a dropdown. And so that way the user can't type the wrong code. And if the user only has access to one company, you could even get rid of the drop-down list altogether and save them time and make the integration less error-prone. So there's types of integrations which don't have users, and so you have to rely on feedback from your system only. So systems that run batches nightly, that kind of thing. So in those cases, it's even more important that you have good logging and that you have a view into what's going on. So in those types of systems, I'd recommend using like a dead letter queue or a stateful workflow system so that you can always, as a developer, see what's going on and then, again, use that information to loop back and improve your integration. So that was just a couple of the errors that you can get from the API. There's a full list at developer.avalera.com/avattax/errors. And you can also find the rest of the documentation for our APIs at developer.avalera.com. The next strategy that I'll talk about that you can use is a local content cache. And that allows you to keep your integration running and calculate sales tax even if there's a connectivity issue or if there's a service issue. And so to do that, the basic idea is you'll call the download tax rates by zip code API, and that returns a CSV file of tax rate estimates, and make that available to your integration while there's a connectivity issue or a service issue. And then once you detect that the service is back up, you can submit those transactions afterward. But this allows you to keep running and calculating sales tax even if there's an API issue. And here's some pseudocode of an example of a local content cache. So it downloads the file every half hour. It checks for a new file. The file is updated every 24 hours. So a half hour is a good interval to make sure that you've got the most up-to-date one. And then it parses the file and makes it available to the program so that it can calculate taxes while there's a connectivity issue. And so there's certain taxes you can calculate and certain you can't with that. So again, if you go to developer.avalera.com, you can read the documentation for that API and all of our APIs. So those are ways that that Avalara makes sure that integrations are robust, and some strategies that you can also use. And so thanks for joining me today, and we'll be open for questions now.